Quan Deyu in the Jade, Terrace style. Last night, the sash of my robe came loose. This morning, spiders are weaving webs. I still have some makeup I couldn't throw away. Do these omens mean my husband will at last come home? So just like with the poetry we've been reading in the previous days, Quan Deyu is a poet that is represented by only one poem in this anthology, so not one of the top tier writers, but he was definitely different from another perspective, in that he was a pretty successful scholar official, reaching the highest posts, or close to the highest posts in the bureaucracy, something that only very few of the poems in this anthology can claim, maybe Yuan Shen or Zhang Zhulin, and something to which all of them aspired. That was their real objective, really, for most of these, or all of these scholar officials. Their dream was not actually, or not essentially, to get an eternal literary reputation. It was rather to, be able to have a high post in the bureaucracy and rule and improve the world. So who was Quan Deyu? Well, again, like Wang Jiang or Li Duan, the poets we've been talking about recently, he is a mid-Tang period poet. He was born in 761, a native of Luoyang. Already from his youth he showed signs of being a child prodigy, allegedly composing his first poem at the age of 4, and writing well-regarded scholarly essays before he was 15. In 780 he was appointed editor in the palace library. Later he served as erudite of the Chamberlain for ceremonials during the 785-805 period, and he rose to be vice minister of rites. By 806 he was vice minister of war and later chief minister of the court of imperial sacrifices. In 810 he became minister of rites and jointly manager of affairs with the secretariat chancellery, so one of the highest posts in the civil administration. In 816 he went out to become regional military commissioner of the Shannan and Shanxi areas, where he became ill, and he died en route home to the capital in 818. Okay, moving on to this poem and to the topic of this poem, the first thing that strikes one is the title, in the Jade Terrace style. And this needs a little bit of clarification. I think we've talked a lot in previous poems about a certain anthology of poetry that exerted some influence, an ambivalent influence, on the Tang Dynasty writers. This anthology is the New Songs from the Jade Terrace, Ju Tai Xing Yong. So this was an anthology of early medieval Chinese poetry in the romantic or semi-erotic palace style, gongti, which was composed during the Southern Dynasties period. More specifically, the anthology was basically compiled in the mid-530s by scholar Xu Ling, and in the service of Xiaogang, crown prince of the Liang dynasty, who would later become Emperor Jianwen, and who was a writer in this style and who was a patron of this type of poetry. Now, the poetry of the New Songs of the Jade Terrace has generally had a bad report in China among the traditional scholarly and Confucian elite, because these are mainly songs about the life of palace ladies. The typical poem of the New Songs from the Jade Terrace is a slightly erotical poem with this beautiful concubine or imperial wife in a luxurious setting, languishing and sighing for her beloved. So they were probably the first poems to be composed or among the first poems to be composed in Chinese that completely cast away the pretense of having a moralistic message, of following the Confucian tradition. That is, the criteria for them were basically erotic, pleasurable, and aestheticist, like a good metrical form and good use of images. So they were generally regarded by rigid Confucians as decadent poetry, immoral poetry, the decadent fruit of a decadent era. Still, we do find many poems in this collection that participate in the palace style that the New Song mainly the New Songs from the Jade Terrace very well represents. So, accordingly, this is a poem that will basically have a woman in luxurious quarters, and the poem, in a way, acts as a voyeuristic portal into seeing her luxurious surroundings, and getting in touch with her feelings. And there's this mildly erotic element in which the woman might be able to explicitly state her desire, and that's pretty clear in this poem. So, paraphrasing it, the topic or the story behind this poem is pretty clear. There's a woman, she's a married woman, in this case doesn't seem to be an imperial concubine or anything like that. Her husband has been away and she is anxious for his return. She is desirous of his return. There is, an implicit element of female sexual desire in the poem. And you could say that in the poem she's seeing some omens that she interprets as a sign that her husband is going to come home back again. So again, the voicing of female desire, Confucians were pretty prudish, so this sort of thing, not very typical. We have a lot of poems that we've encountered in this anthology, and you can find elsewhere, where you have a woman lamenting the absence of her beloved, of her husband. But again, in the Six Dynasties, it was more, and in this poem as well, it's more typical, or there is an element of female eroticism, of female desire being voiced. So she's not only missing him, because, a woman should miss her husband, she has her own needs as well. So let's take a look at the poem. First couplet. Last night, the sash of my robe came loose. This morning, spiders are weaving webs. So the two images, which might appear pretty innocent to us, they're coded. So a woman's sash falling open spontaneously, this was believed to be an omen of good luck, of something good about to happen. And the same thing happens with the spiders, because apparently the word for spider has the same sound as a word meaning happy. The image of a woman's sash getting loose is connected with erotic images from the poetry of the Six Dynasties. I think there is a poem from the early Six Dynasties period in which there's this woman saying that the wind is, she's talking to a man in the poem, and she's saying that the wind is loosening her sash, like, her clothes are opening, which, it very clearly seems to point at her sexual availability, which, however indirectly, I think is being pointed here as well. Yeah. So that sash getting loose, the sash would get loose when the husband returned and he unclothed his women for intimate relations. So there's this woman at home. She gets these two indirect elements, her sash becoming loose, spiders weaving webs, and she interprets them as part of a tradition that points towards good luck happening. So probably to her beloved husband returning to her, and conjugal bliss following. Second couplet. I still have some makeup I couldn't throw away. Do these omens mean my husband will at last come home? So the second couplet actually includes the interpretation. You have those two omens. The second couplet actually explains them. The first line says, well, the explanation actually comes in the fourth line, but the third line includes the idea that there's still some makeup which I can use to prettify myself, to, do my toilette so that I might be looking as good as possible. And there's this idea, of course, that the husband or whoever has been away for a long time and the woman hasn't needed to use her makeup to embellish herself, as her lover was too far away and beyond her grasp. But do these omens mean my husband will at last come home? So these spiders, the sash loosening, does this mean that my husband is coming back? Should I start using the makeup I still have somewhere hidden around to prettify myself, because at last he is coming home? So that's it, really. So I think the poem, is of course slightly superficial, frivolous, the sort of thing composed beyond the pale of the Confucian orthodoxy. I think it's a quite nice poem, probably very representative of the style it purports to imitate, and also gives us a glance at poetry that does not just squarely fit into the Confucian molds. A lot of the poems that Tang poets composed, we talked about it a lot of times, were social poems. So some were composed at gatherings of other scholar officials, some were composed at court, and sometimes at parties, and there sometimes the topics had to be, pleasurable topics, not just Confucian ethical poems, but light-hearted poems celebrating banquets and feasting and desire and things like that. And we also had some share of these poems that we've already encountered in the anthology. This would fit probably into that line of poetry, if it's not just an aesthetic exercise on the part of the author in showing his ability at imitating an old style. It could have been part of this imperially commissioned or poetry for some entertainment in the palace.